The polycarbonate shield vibrated against my forearm as a 300-pound man in a home team jersey slammed into it. But he wasn't trying to tackle me. He was trying to eat my throat. I jammed the bottom edge of the shield into his shins and shoved, watching him tumble back into the screaming crowd. My name is Miller. I was a riot cop for the city, and that night, I was supposed to be easy overtime at the stadium. 70,000 people were packed into those stands. It was the fourth quarter when the world ended. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a ripple of screaming in the luxury boxes that flowed down to the field like a red wave. My radio was a mess of static and screaming. Sarge was yelling something about a biohazard, but then he got cut off by a wet, crunching sound that I still hear when I close my eyes. I gripped my baton until my knuckles turned white. My partner, Rico, looked at me through his cracked visor. His eyes were wide. We were standing in the tunnel entrance of Section 108. A woman ran toward us, her face half gone, trailing a red ribbon of skin. She didn't slow down. I raised my shield, but she hit it with the force of a truck. This wasn't a riot. This was a feeding frenzy. I pushed her off and Rico used his baton, a heavy strike to the temple. She didn't go down. She just turned and snapped her teeth at his wrist. I drew my sidearm, the Glock 17 feeling heavy and cold. I fired once, twice. The rounds hit her chest, but she didn't stop. It took a third shot, directly through the eye, to make her drop. The sound of the gunshot was swallowed by the roar of the stadium. People were jumping from the balconies to escape the things in the concourse. I grabbed Rico by his tactical vest and pulled him back into the tunnel. We had to move. The stadium was a giant concrete trap. We ran past the concession stands where the smell of popcorn was being replaced by the iron tang of fresh blood. A group of 5 of them came around the corner. They weren't slow. They were fast, jerky, and driven by a hunger that looked like pure electricity. I used my shield as a battering ram, knocking 2 aside, while Rico cleared a path with his service weapon. We ducked into a storage room and slammed the steel door shut. My heart was a drum in my chest. I checked my gear. 3 spare mags. A heavy-duty flashlight. Zip ties. A multi-tool. Rico was bleeding from a scrape on his arm, not a bite, just a fall. We used duct tape from a shelf to reinforce our joints. If they couldn't get their teeth through the tape and the Kevlar, we had a chance. We heard the scratching on the door. Dozens of fingers, blunt and frantic, scraping against the metal. I looked at the blueprints on the wall. We were near the locker rooms. If we could get to the underground parking, we could get out. But the parking garage was 4 levels of darkness and tight corners. We waited until the scratching stopped, then I slowly cracked the door. The hallway was a graveyard. Bodies everywhere, but some of them were twitching. We moved in a low crouch, shield up, weapons ready. Every shadow was a threat. We reached the locker room entrance when the overhead lights flickered and died. Total darkness. I clicked on my weapon light. The beam cut through the dust and smoke, landing on a pile of equipment bags. And then the pile moved. A player, still in full pads but with his jaw hanging by a thread, lunged out. He was a wall of muscle. I fired, but the helmet deflected the shot. He slammed into me, pinning my shield against my chest. I could smell the rot on his breath. I reached for my combat knife, the steel sliding out of the sheath with a hiss. I jammed it under the rim of his helmet, through the jaw and up. He went limp, his weight nearly crushing me. I pushed him off, gasping for air. Rico was gone. I looked around, my light sweeping the room. The back door to the showers was open. I heard a muffled scream and the sound of something heavy breaking. I ran toward it, my boots splashing in something wet. I reached the showers just in time to see a group of them cornering Rico. He was out of ammo, swinging his helmet like a flail. I stepped up, breathing hard, knowing my next move was either going to save us or end us both. I threw a flashbang I'd been saving. The white light blinded them for a second, giving us a window. We sprinted for the service elevator. The doors were closing slow, agonizingly slow. A hand reached through the gap, a pale, clawed hand. I slammed my boot into it and the doors clicked shut. We were moving down. Then, the elevator groaned and jerked to a violent stop between floors. The emergency lights kicked on, casting everything in a sick red glow. From the top of the elevator car, we heard the heavy thud of something landing. Then another thud. They were on the roof. The metal ceiling started to buckle under their weight. I looked at Rico. He looked at the ceiling. We were trapped in a metal box, and the lids were about to come off. The metal of the elevator ceiling didn't just bend, it screamed. It was that high-pitched, structural groan that tells you the physics of your situation are about to fail. Rico and I were backed into the far corner, away from the control panel. My breath was coming in short, jagged stabs that burned my throat. The red emergency light pulsed, making the blood on my visor look black, then bright crimson, then black again. Thud. Another one landed on the roof. The rivets began to pop, snapping like pistol shots in the confined space. I shifted my grip on the Riot baton. My palms were slick inside my tactical gloves, a mixture of sweat and the oily residue of the stadium's industrial cleaners. Rico looked at me, his face a mask of pale exhaustion, his eyes darting to the service hatch in the ceiling. He didn't have to say it. If they broke through that hatch, we were in a vertical coffin. I reached for my belt, fingers fumbling over the pouches until I felt the familiar weight of a heavy-duty zip tie. I didn't know why I grabbed it, maybe some subconscious instinct to bind something, to fix a world that was falling apart, but I shoved it back and grabbed my backup sidearm instead. It was a compact 9mm, and I only had one magazine left for it. The first breakthrough happened at the seam of the hatch. A gray, bloated finger poked through, followed by a hand that had lost half its skin to the jagged metal. It didn't feel pain. It just clawed, the fingernails scraping against the steel with a sound that made my marrow vibrate. I didn't wait. I stepped forward, planted my boots, and thrust the tip of my baton upward into the gap. I felt the resistance of soft tissue and then the solid thunk of the baton hitting the roof's underside. I twisted, trying to jam the hatch shut, but the weight from above was too much. The metal lid buckled downward, a shower of dust and flakes of paint falling into my eyes. Rico barked out a curse and lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into the buckling plate. We were two men trying to hold back a tide of meat and hunger with nothing but a bit of aluminum and sheer terror. The elevator gave another violent lurch. The cables hummed, a low, terrifying vibration that I could feel in my teeth. We were dangling between the fourth floor and the sub-basement, suspended by nothing but grease and wire while a pack of those things tried to unwrap us like a canned ham. A second hand joined the first, then a face, or what used to be a face, squeezed into the narrow opening. It was a stadium usher, still wearing the tattered yellow vest. One eye was gone, replaced by a dark hole, and the other was milky and fixed on my throat. It snapped its teeth, a dry, clicking sound that cut through the mechanical hum of the elevator. I dropped the baton, drew the 9mm, and fired a single shot point blank. The sound in the small metal box was deafening, a physical blow to the eardrums. The usher's head snapped back, and the weight on the hatch shifted momentarily as the body slid off. "We gotta go, now!" Rico yelled, his voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. He grabbed the emergency manual release handle on the side of the door. He yanked it, but the elevator was offset. We were looking at a solid concrete wall, with only a 4-inch gap of the floor above visible. "Not there!" I shouted. I looked up. The hatch was hanging by one hinge now. More of them were crowding the top of the car. He didn't hesitate. He interlaced his fingers, creating a step. I stepped into his hands and he hoisted me up with a grunt of pure adrenaline. I grabbed the edge of the jagged hatch opening. The metal sliced through my glove, biting into the meat of my palm, but I didn't let go. I hauled myself up, my head emerging into the dark, cavernous space of the elevator shaft. The air up there was freezing and smelled of old grease and ozone. 2 of them were standing on the roof of the car, barely 3 feet away. They were distracted, clawing at the hole I'd just come through. I didn't give them a chance to turn. I swung my heavy boot, catching the closest one in the side of the knee. I heard the joint snap, a wet, splintering sound. It collapsed, and I followed up with a kick to its chest, sending it tumbling off the edge of the car into the dark void of the shaft below. It didn't scream. It just hit the sides of the shaft on the way down, thump, scrape, thump, until a distant, wet crunch signaled the end of its fall. The second one turned, its fingers elongated and stained dark. I didn't have room to swing the baton. I reached out, grabbed its throat, and slammed it against the steel cable. The cable was moving, vibrating, and as the thing's neck hit the wire, the friction tore through its skin like a saw. I pushed harder, my muscles screaming, until the head was nearly severed and the body went limp. I kicked it over the side too. "Rico! Give me your hand." I leaned down into the hole. Rico was fending off a hand that was reaching through the door gap below. He jumped, caught my grip, and I hauled him up. We stood on the roof of the swaying elevator car, surrounded by the humming darkness of the shaft. Above us, the ladder was a few feet out of reach, bolted to the concrete wall. Below us, the car groaned again. One of the main cables had snapped. "Jump for the ladder." I pointed to the rusted iron rungs. Rico went first. He was heavier, burdened by the remains of his riot gear and his shield, which he'd miraculously kept strapped to his back. He leaped, his fingers catching a rung. The ladder groaned, pulling slightly away from the wall, but it held. He scrambled up a few feet and then looked back at me. I took a breath, looked at the flickering red light coming from the hole in the elevator roof, and jumped. I caught the rung just as the second cable gave way. The elevator car didn't just fall, it vanished. 1 second it was under my feet, a solid island in the dark, and the next it was a screaming weight plummeting into the depths. The crash from the bottom was a dull explosion that shook the entire shaft. Dust billowed up, thick, and we climbed in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My forearms were burning, the lactic acid turning my blood to lead. Every rung was a battle. We reached a maintenance door on the 3rd level. Rico kicked it. It was locked. He kicked it again, using the flat of his boot near the handle. On the 3rd kick, the frame splintered. We tumbled into a narrow corridor filled with pipes and humming electrical transformers. This was the guts of the stadium, the places the fans never saw. The walls were unpainted cinder block, and the floor was stained with ancient oil leaks. I sat down for a second, my back against a cold pipe, and checked my gear. My baton was gone. My sidearm had 3 rounds left in the mag and none in the chamber. I looked at Rico. He was stripped down to his tattered uniform shirt, he'd ditched the chest protector when it got snagged on the ladder. He was holding a heavy pipe wrench he'd found on the floor. "We need a weapon for you," I whispered. My voice was a rasp. "I'll manage," he said, tapping the wrench against his palm. "Where are we?" "Level 3. Maintenance. This should lead to the loading docks if we head south." We started moving. The silence here was different. It wasn't the silence of an empty room, it was the silence of a predator waiting. We passed a janitor's closet. I pried the door open with the edge of Rico's wrench. Inside, we found a gallon of industrial bleach and a long-handled floor scraper, the kind with a 4-inch steel blade meant for taking gum off concrete. I took the scraper. It wasn't a sword, but it had reach. I checked a map pinned to the wall. Stadium services, you are here. We were a long way from the parking lot. We reached the double steel doors of the commissary 10 minutes later. I put my ear to the metal. I didn't hear snarling. I heard something worse, the rhythmic, wet sound of something being torn. I looked at Rico and held up 3 fingers. On one, we pushed. The doors swung open with a hiss of hydraulic fluid. The kitchen was a nightmare of stainless steel and fluorescent flickers. Huge vats of soup were still simmering, the smell of burnt onions thick enough to gag on. But the floor was covered in them. Not just a few. A whole shift of kitchen staff, still in their white coats, were hunched over something in the center of the room. They were feeding. The sound was like a dozen dogs over a kill. One of them, a massive guy with a chef's hat still pinned to his balding head, looked up. His face was a mask of gore, a string of something long and gray hanging from his teeth. He let out a low, guttural hoot, and the others began to rise. Back to the hall. Rico hissed, raising his wrench. No, I said, eyeing the industrial deep fryers to our left. The hall's a dead end. We go through. I grabbed a heavy metal tray from a rack and held it like a shield. The chef thing lunged. He was fast, faster than the ones in the stands. I stepped inside his reach and slammed the edge of the floor scraper into his throat. The blade was sharp enough to bite deep, but it got stuck in the gristle. He didn't stop. He slammed into me, his weight pinning me against a prep table. I could smell the rot on his breath, the metallic tang of the blood he'd been drinking. Rico came in from the side, the pipe wrench descending in a brutal arc. It caught the chef in the temple, and the skull collapsed with a sickening pop. The body went limp, and I shoved it off me, finally wrenching my scraper free. But the others were on us now. 5, 6, 10 of them. They moved with a jerky, frantic energy. I grabbed the handle of a nearby vat of boiling oil, the safety catch was already off. I didn't think, I just tilted. A wave of shimmering, white-hot grease cascaded across the floor. The scream that came from the things wasn't human. It was a high-pitched shriek of scorched vocal cords. The first 3 in line went down, their skin blistering and peeling instantly as they slid in the grease. They didn't die, but they couldn't get their footing. They thrashed in the oil, making the floor a death trap for anyone else trying to cross. The walk-in. I shouted, pointing to the massive freezer at the back. It was our only cover. We ran, our boots sliding on the slick floor. I felt a hand grab my ankle. I went down hard, my chin hitting the stainless steel edge of a table. Stars exploded in my vision. I turned over, kicking wildly. It was a small woman, a server, her jaw missing, her tongue lolling out as she crawled through the boiling oil to get to me. Her hands were charred black, the bones showing through the melted flesh, but she was still clawing. I brought the floor scraper down like an axe, splitting her head down the middle. Rico grabbed my collar and hauled me up, shoving me toward the freezer door. We burst inside and slammed the heavy insulated door. Rico threw the latch. It was pitch black and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in a thick cloud. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. We weren't alone. Hanging from the ceiling hooks were sides of beef, wrapped in plastic. But in the corner, huddled behind a stack of frozen fry boxes, was a man. He was wearing a suit, expensive. Don't let them in, he whimpered. Who are you? I asked, my light fixed on him. I'm the CFO. I was in the box. The glass, it didn't hold. They just kept coming. Shut up, Rico snapped. He was at the door, listening. The scratching on the other side had started. Soft at first, then harder. Then the thudding began. They knew we were in here. The freezer was a fortress, but it was also a tomb. If we stayed, we'd freeze. If we left, we'd be eaten. I looked around the freezer. It was industrial size, meant to hold enough food for a weekend of playoff games. At the far end, I saw a ventilation grate. It's too small for us with the gear, Rico said, looking at his broad shoulders. Then we strip. The CFO goes first. The suit man scrambled up, desperate. Yes, please. We moved the boxes, stacking them to reach the grate. I used the floor scraper to pry the screws loose. The metal was frozen, brittle. They snapped off one by one. I pulled the grate away, revealing a dark, square tunnel that smelled of dust and old coal. I looked at the CFO. Get in. If you stop moving, I'll kick you through. He didn't need further encouragement. I looked at Rico. He was looking at the door. The steel was beginning to dent. Something out there was hitting it with more force than a human should possess. You next, I said. I can't make it with the shield, Elias, he said, using my name for the first time tonight. Ditch it. The shield is for crowd control. This isn't a crowd anymore. It's a harvest. He unbuckled the straps, the heavy plexiglass hitting the floor with a hollow ring. He climbed up, his bulk barely fitting into the duct. He shimmed forward, his boots disappearing. I was alone in the freezer. The thumping on the door was constant now, a drumbeat of doom. I looked at the sides of beef hanging around me. I had an idea, a desperate, stupid idea. I took the gallon of bleach I'd carried from the janitor's closet and began pouring it over the floor, mixing it with the spilled blood and the condensation. Then I grabbed a canister of industrial-strength oven cleaner from a shelf. I knew if I mixed them, I'd create a cloud of chlorine gas that would melt the lungs of anything breathing. It wouldn't kill the dead, but it might slow them down, give me a few extra seconds. I cracked the seal on the oven cleaner, set it near the door, and then scrambled up the boxes. I was halfway into the vent when the freezer door finally gave. The latch didn't break, the hinges were ripped clean out of the frame. The door fell inward with a thunderous crash. I didn't look back. I kicked the boxes over, spilling the bleach and the cleaner together. A hiss filled the room, a sharp, chemical sting that immediately began to burn my nostrils even from the height of the vent. I pulled myself into the duct, my shoulders scraping the sides. It was tight. I felt the cold metal pressing against my chest, the darkness swallowing me. I crawled, my fingers digging into the rivets of the ductwork. Behind me, I heard them enter. I heard the wet slithering of their feet on the bleach-slicked floor. Then I heard the coughing, not the human kind, but a wet, rattling sound as the gas began to do its work. But they didn't stop. They were piling into the freezer. I could hear them hitting the wall below the vent. A hand reached up, fingers brushing against the edge of the duct. I crawled faster, the metal booming with every movement. Rico? You there? I hissed into the dark. Keep coming, his voice echoed from somewhere ahead. It opens up into a mechanical room. The duct began to slope downward. I was sliding now, my boots unable to find purchase. I picked up speed, the metal burning my skin through my shirt. I rounded a corner and saw light, a dim, yellow glow. I shot out of the duct like a bullet, landing on a pile of discarded air filters. Rico was there, helping the CFO to his feet. We were in a room filled with massive air handling units, the giant fans silent and still. The room had one exit, a heavy steel door marked "Loading Dock Authorized Personnel Only." We moved toward it, my heart hammering against my ribs. Rico had his wrench out. I had my floor scraper. We reached the door and I put my hand on the lever. I looked at them. Whatever is on the other side, we don't stop. We run for the perimeter fence. I pulled the lever. The door swung open to the loading dock. It was a cavernous space, lit by flickering sodium lamps. Dozens of semi-trucks were parked in the bays, their trailers open and empty. But the floor was a sea of them. Hundreds. Maybe 1,000. They were all standing still, facing the center of the dock where a massive, industrial shredder for trash was humming. Standing on top of the shredder was something I hadn't seen yet. It was a man, or it had been, but he was huge, distended, his skin stretched tight over muscle that looked like knotted rope. He was holding a Riot shield in one hand and a jagged piece of rebar in the other. He looked like a twisted version of us. He saw us. He didn't moan. He let out a roar that echoed off the concrete walls like a freight train. The sea of dead turned as one. 1,000 pairs of milky eyes fixed on the three of us standing in the doorway. The giant on the shredder pointed the rebar at us, and the horde began to move. Not a shuffle. A sprint. Back inside. Rico yelled, slamming his weight against the door. But the door didn't close. A hand, a massive, gray hand, caught the edge. The giant was already there, his speed impossible for his size. He shoved the door back, the force throwing Rico across the room. I lunged with the floor scraper, aiming for the giant's neck, but he caught the wooden handle in his fist and snapped it like a toothpick. He grabbed me by the front of my vest and lifted me off the floor, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled like a mass grave in the sun. He opened his mouth, rows of jagged, broken teeth bared, and then the CFO screamed as the first wave of the horde poured into the room behind him. I reached for my belt, my fingers closing around the last thing I had, the heavy-duty zip tie, and I realized I wasn't going to use it to fix anything. I jammed my thumb into the giant's remaining eye as his jaws clamped down on my shoulder. The pressure on my shoulder was a crushing, rhythmic grinding. I could feel the individual teeth of the giant, some jersey-clad monster who must have been a defensive end before the world ended, shearing through the outer layers of my heavy-duty nylon carrier. The ballistic plates were designed to stop a .357 round, but they weren't meant to withstand the focused, hydraulic force of a jaw that didn't care about snapping its own hinges. My thumb went deep. It didn't feel like a movie. It felt like pushing into a cold, overripe grapefruit. There was a wet pop, a sickening slide of ocular fluid, and the creature let out a sound that wasn't a scream, it was a pressurized exhaust of rot. He didn't drop me. He threw me. I hit the industrial shelving unit behind the catering table, my spine screaming as the metal supports buckled. My vision went white, then strobed with red pulses. Across the room, Rico was up, but he was pinned. 3 of them, smaller, faster things that had been stadium ushers in their previous life, were swarming him. He was using his tactical flashlight as a kosh, hammering at their temples, but they didn't have the sense to fall down. The CFO was gone. There was no dignity in it. He'd been pulled into the hallway, and the sound coming from out there was like a pack of wolves in a butcher shop, wet, rhythmic tearing and the high, thin whistle of air escaping a punctured throat. I tried to stand, but my left arm was dead weight. The giant was coming for me again, one eye socket a weeping red cavern, his gait lopsided but heavy. I looked for the floor scraper. It was a splintered wreck. I reached for my belt. My radio was gone, ripped off during the throw. My OC spray was crushed. I had nothing but the zip tie still looped in my fingers and the friction lock baton at my hip. I flicked the baton out. The sharp clack of the steel segments locking usually made perps rethink their life choices. This thing didn't even blink. I didn't swing for the head. I knew the skull was too thick on a beast that size. I went for the lead knee. I swung with every ounce of terror-fueled adrenaline I had left. The steel bar connected with the patella. I felt the vibration travel up my arm, a jarring shock that nearly dislocated my wrist. The kneecap shattered, the sound like a dry branch snapping. The giant went down to one leg, but he didn't stop. He crawled. He used those massive hands to drag his bulk toward me, his broken jaw hanging at an impossible angle, dripping black bile onto the linoleum. "Rico!" "The vent!" I yelled, my voice cracking. Rico kicked an usher square in the chest, the force sending the creature back into the hallway pack. He dived over the catering table, his face masked in a spray of dark fluid that wasn't his. "It's bolted shut. We need a tool. Survival isn't about being a hero. It's about the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act." My observation, the room was being overrun. My orientation, I was injured, gear was failing, and the exit was blocked by a wall of meat. My decision, leverage. I scrambled toward the fallen industrial coffee urn, the big 30-gallon silver cylinder. It was still half full of scalding water from the pre-game prep. I didn't think about the burn. I grabbed the handle with my good hand and kicked the base, tipping the boiling liquid across the floor toward the doorway. The first wave of the horde hit the puddle. They didn't scream from the heat, but the sudden loss of friction on the wet, greasy floor sent them sliding. It bought us 5 seconds. I used those seconds to get to Rico. He was clawing at the grate of the service duct. I jammed the tip of my steel baton into the edge of the vent cover. I leaned my entire body weight into it, using the tool as a pry bar. The push. I hissed. The bolt sheared off with a metallic ring, and the grate swung open. Rico scrambled in first, pulling himself into the narrow, galvanized steel tunnel. I went to follow, but a hand grabbed my boot. It was the giant. He'd crawled through the boiling water, his skin sloughing off in gray sheets, his grip still like a vice. He wasn't trying to eat me anymore, he was just an anchor, pulling me back into the dark. I kicked. My tactical boots, heavy-soled and reinforced, hit him in the face once, twice, 3 times. His nose flattened. His teeth shattered. He didn't let go. I felt my boots slipping off. The laces were slick with blood. The whole boot was sliding off my foot. I didn't wait. I stepped out of the footwear, leaving it in his hand, and hauled myself into the vent. The space was tight, maybe 24 inches wide. It smelled of stagnant air and fried grease from the concession stands. We crawled on our bellies, the sound of our movement echoing like a drum in the metal tube. Behind us, I could hear them hitting the wall, their fingers scratching at the entrance of the vent, the sound of metal being dented by sheer, mindless persistence. "Where does this go?" Rico breathed. His breath was ragged. He was losing his edge. "Utility hub. It should drop us near the player tunnels," I said, though I was guessing. I was trying to visualize the stadium blueprints I'd seen during the briefing 4 hours ago. It felt like 4 years. We crawled for what felt like miles. My shoulder was throbbing, a hot, rhythmic heat that suggested the teeth had gone deeper than I'd hoped. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, and in its place came the bone-deep cold of shock. Then the vent ended. Not at a grate, but at a vertical drop. I peered over the edge. It was a maintenance shaft, 20 feet deep, ending in a pile of discarded jerseys and equipment bags. Beyond that was the corridor leading to the home team locker room. It was lit by the red glow of the emergency lights. It was quiet. Too quiet. "We have to drop," I whispered. Rico didn't argue. He slid over the edge, landing heavily on the bags. I followed, the impact jarring my teeth and sending a fresh wave of agony through my shoulder. We huddled in the shadows, listening. The stadium was a living thing now, a hollow shell filled with the rustle of dry fabric and the occasional, distant shriek that sounded like a steam whistle. We moved toward the locker room. The double doors were reinforced steel. If we could get inside and bar them, we might have a chance to field dress my wound and find a real weapon. But as we reached the doors, I saw the problem. The electronic lock was dead. The mag lock was engaged, and without power, it was a tombstone. "The fire axe," Rico said, pointing to the glass case on the wall. It was empty. Only a few shards of glass remained in the red frame. Someone had been here already. And they hadn't been successful. There were drag marks in the dust, wide, smeary trails of dark fluid leading toward the showers. We turned away, heading deeper into the bowels of the stadium, toward the loading docks. If we could get to the fleet of transport vans, we could drive out. But the mechanics of survival were failing us at every turn. My baton was bent and useless. Rico's flashlight was flickering, the batteries drained from being left on. My vest was heavy, a useless weight now that the threats weren't using knives or guns. I started unbuckling the side straps, letting the heavy ceramic and Kevlar plates thud to the floor. It felt like shedding a shell, leaving me vulnerable but fast. We reached the loading dock entrance. The massive roll-up doors were down. There was a small man door to the side. Rico put his ear to it. He shook his head. "I hear them. A lot of them. We don't have a choice, Rico. The vent is the only way back, and they're in there now." I grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall. It was the only thing left. I felt the weight of it, 10 pounds of pressurized powder. It wasn't a sword, but it was a club. "On 3, I said. Rico gripped the handle of the man door. He looked at me, his eyes wide, the whites gleaming. 1, 2, 3. He yanked the door. It didn't lead to the loading dock. It led to the press conference room. The room was tiered, like a small theater. And every single seat was occupied. They weren't moving. They were sitting there, hundreds of them, their heads bowed, a sea of silent, gray shapes. It was a cathedral of the damned. The door creaked, the sound echoing in the silence. At the front of the room, at the podium, a figure stood. It was dressed in a suit, its tie perfectly knotted, but its skin was a translucent, sickly yellow. It turned its head with a slow, mechanical precision. It didn't snarl. It didn't rush. In unison, the hundreds of figures in the seats lifted their heads. "Close it," I whispered. Rico closed the door. But the door didn't close. The hinges had caught on a piece of discarded clothing on the floor. Rico pulled, but the door stayed ajar by 3 inches. The hum from the podium grew louder, a resonant frequency that made the floor vibrate. The things in the seats began to stand. They didn't move like the others. They moved in sync, a terrifying, coordinated wave of movement. "Back," Rico gasped, tripping over his own feet. "Back to the tunnel." We turned to run, but the corridor behind us was no longer empty. The giant was there. He had followed us through the vents. He was dragging his shattered leg, his body twisted, his one eye fixed on us with a dull, predatory focus. Behind him, Dozens of others were spilling out of the service duct, dropping. We were caught in the throat of the stadium. I looked at the fire extinguisher in my hand. I looked at Rico, who was fumbling with his belt, looking for anything, a pen, a key, a coin, to use as a weapon. My instinct was screaming at me to climb, to find high ground, but there was nowhere to go. The giant roared, a sound that was answered by the hundreds of voices in the press room. The door Rico had been trying to close was kicked open from the other side. The suit-clad thing at the podium was the first one out, its movements fluid and fast, unlike the staggering wrecks we'd seen before. It was a different breed. I felt the cold grip of the breaking point. Everything I'd been trained for, the riot formations, the escalation of force, the tactical retreats, it was all garbage. It was a script for a world that had been deleted. The giant lunged. I swung the fire extinguisher, the heavy base connecting with his temple. The metal dented, but he didn't go down. He grabbed the extinguisher, his fingers bending the metal casing. He ripped it out of my hands and tossed it aside like a toy. I was down to my bare hands. Rico was backed against the wall, a small pocket knife out, the blade no longer than 3 inches. The suit-clad creature reached us first. It didn't bite. It grabbed my throat with a hand that felt like a steel cuff. It lifted me, the strength in its arm impossible. I clawed at its face, my fingernails tearing through its skin, but there was no blood, only a thick, clear ichor. Then, the lights went out. Total darkness. The kind of darkness that felt like a physical weight on the eyeballs. In the blackness, the sound changed. The humming stopped. In its place was the sound of something very large, very heavy, and very fast moving through the crowd. It wasn't one of them. It was something else. A high-pitched, electronic chirp echoed through the hallway. Chirp. 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 A thermal optic clicked on somewhere in the dark, a tiny red dot appearing on the chest of the creature holding me. Target acquired, a voice said, a voice that sounded like it was coming through a gas mask. The creature's grip tightened. I couldn't breathe. My ribs were beginning to crack under the pressure. I looked toward the red dot, my vision fading into black spots. The red dot moved from the creature's chest to its forehead. Clean sweep, the voice said. A flash of muzzle fire lit the room for a microsecond. In that sliver of light, I saw them. Not cops. Not soldiers. Something else. They were wearing matte black environmental suits, their faces hidden behind bug-eyed lenses. They weren't here to rescue us. They were carrying flamethrowers and long, curved blades that looked like industrial shears. The creature holding me was slammed backward by the force of the shot, its head disappearing in a spray of gray mist. I hit the floor, gasping, my lungs burning. Non-targets identified, one of the black-clad figures said, his voice cold and distorted. He stepped over me, his heavy boot pinning my hand to the floor. He didn't look down. He raised a device that looked like a high-intensity ultraviolet floodlight. The infestation is at stage 4, he said into his comms. Initiate the sterilization. Rico screamed as one of the other figures grabbed him by the hair. Wait. We're police. We're on your side. The figure didn't answer. He pulled a long, thin needle from a pouch on his thigh. Sterilize everything, the leader repeated. I tried to move, but the giant was still there in the dark. I could hear his breath, a wet, rattling sound, just inches from my ear. He wasn't dead. And the men in black didn't seem to care about the zombies. They were looking at us. The leader pointed the UV light at the giant. The creature shrieked, its skin bubbling and smoking under the intense rays. But it didn't back away. It lunged at the man in black. In the chaos of the strobe lights and the screaming, I saw my chance. I saw the utility belt the leader was wearing. It had a flare. A white phosphorus flare. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The giant's hand closed around the leader's helmet, the sound of Kevlar snapping like dry crackers. The other men in black opened fire, their weapons hushed, the thwip-thwip of suppressed rounds filling the air. I grabbed the flare. I pulled the pin. The world turned into a sun. The white light was blinding, a searing heat that felt like it was melting my retinas. The zombies recoiled, their sensitive eyes overwhelmed. The men in black shielded their visors. Run! I choked out, grabbing Rico's collar. We didn't go for the door. We didn't go for the vent. We went for the elevator shaft, the doors of which had been pried open during the struggle. We jumped. It wasn't a long drop, maybe 10 feet to the top of the elevator car, but it was enough to get us out of the immediate line of fire. We lay there, panting, the white light of the flare reflecting off the walls of the shaft above us. Then, the elevator began to move. Not down. Up. Toward the executive suites. Toward the very top of the stadium where the luxury boxes were. And from above us, through the emergency hatch of the elevator car, came a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It was a laugh. A dry, wheezing laugh. I wondered when you boys would show up, a voice said. The hatch creaked open. A hand reached down, a human hand, clean and manicured. Come on up, the voice said. The show is just starting, and you have the best seats in the house. I looked at Rico. He looked at the hand. Behind us, in the shaft, the first of the men in black was already climbing the cable, his movement spider-like and silent. Below him, the horde was piling into the shaft, a tower of meat climbing over itself to reach us. We were trapped between a mysterious benefactor, a squad of cold-blooded cleaners, and a stadium full of the dead. The elevator lurched, the cable groaning under the weight. Choose quickly, the voice from above whispered. The doors on the 50-yard line are about to open, and you really don't want to be in the basement when they do. I reached out. I took the hand. As I was pulled through the hatch, I looked down one last time. The floor of the stadium, the actual field, was visible through a gap in the shaft. It wasn't empty. The turf was gone. In its place was something pulsing, a vast, organic carpet of gray matter that covered the entire 100 yards. And it was breathing. The elevator hit the top floor with a violent jar. The doors slid open. I stepped out into a room filled with monitors. Every screen showed a different part of the city. Every screen showed the same thing, the lights going out, block by block. Welcome to the end of the world, the man said. He turned around. He was wearing the stadium owner's championship ring. And in his other hand, he held a remote with a single, red button. Do you want to see what happens when the stadium turns? He asked, his finger hovering over the switch. Outside, the roar of 100,000 voices, not human, not animal, rose up from the bowl of the stadium, a sound so loud it cracked the glass of the luxury suite. The finger pressed down. The click of the button was a tiny, plastic sound that shouldn't have been able to trigger the end of everything, but it did. I didn't wait for the owner to give me a villainous monologue or explain the science of the gray carpet pulsating on the turf below. I lunged. My Riot shield, a heavy slab of reinforced polycarbonate, caught him under the jaw with a sickening crunch of bone and teeth. The impact sent him backward, his head snapping against the edge of the mahogany desk. He crumpled like a rag doll, the remote skittering across the floor. I didn't check his pulse. I didn't care. Outside, the world was screaming. The ultraviolet stadium lights flickered on, casting a nauseating, bruised purple glow over the 100,000 people in the stands. From this height, I could see the change happening in real time. It wasn't like the movies where people just get sick and die. This was an eruption. The gray matter on the field, the organic carpet, sent out a visible ripple, a wave of kinetic energy that hit the front rows first. I watched through the reinforced glass as the fans in the lower tier were jerked forward, their spines snapping in unison as their bodies were integrated into a singular, vibrating frequency. The sound that followed wasn't a scream, it was a rhythmic, low-frequency thrum that vibrated the marrow in my bones. The glass of the luxury suite didn't just break, it disintegrated under the sheer pressure of that sound. Shards of diamond-clear glass flew inward like shrapnel. I threw my arm up, my tactical sleeve taking the brunt of the glass spray, but a sliver sliced deep into my cheek. I felt the hot crawl of blood down my neck. The air that rushed in smelled like ozone, rotting meat, and something sweet, like overripe peaches. The elevators were dead. The screens showed the city lights dying, a black tide rolling across the grid as the stadium's surge pulled every ounce of local power. I turned and sprinted for the service stairs. My boots pounded the plush carpet of the executive hallway. I was carrying 40 pounds of gear, the vest, the ceramic plates, the belt, the shield, the helmet. Every ounce felt like a lead weight dragging me toward the floor. I reached the heavy steel door to the stairwell and kicked the bar. It didn't budge. Something was holding it from the other side. I backed up, lowered my shoulder, and drove my entire weight into the door. It gave an inch. I heard the wet, slapping sound of something being crushed in the gap. I did it again, screaming through gritted teeth, my quads burning as I drove my legs into the floor. On the third hit, the door groaned and swung open, spilling 3 things that used to be stadium security guards onto the floor. They weren't just dead. They were fused together, their limbs intertwined with gray, ropey filaments that looked like fungal strands. One of them, half his face missing, tried to snap at my boot. I didn't waste a bullet. I brought the edge of the shield down on his neck, using the weight to sever the spine. The thud was muffled by the carpet-like growth already spreading up the stairwell walls. I started down. 30 flights. My breath came in ragged, jagged gasps, fogging up the interior of my gas mask. I tore the mask off, it was useless against this anyway, and let it hang by the strap. The air was thick and humid. By the 20th floor, the thrumming from the stadium bowl was so loud I couldn't hear my own footsteps. The stairs were slick with a gray, translucent slime. I slipped twice, my shield clattering against the concrete, the sound echoing up the shaft like a gunshot. On the 15th floor, the door burst open. A tide of fans poured in. They weren't running, they were being propelled by the growth, their movements jerky and unnatural. I planted my feet, locked my shield arm, and drew my sidearm. I fired 3 rounds into the lead creature's chest. The 9mm slugs did nothing. They just sank into the gray mass. I shifted my aim and blew its knee apart. It fell, and the ones behind it tripped, creating a bottleneck. I didn't stop to reload. I holstered the Glock and drew the heavy wooden riot baton. This was about physics now. Force and leverage. I stepped into the mess of limbs, swinging the baton in short, brutal arcs. By the 10th floor, the walls were breathing. The gray matter had coated the concrete entirely, pulsating in time with the roar outside. I could feel the heat radiating off it. It was a hive, a massive biological engine, and I was a grain of sand inside the gears. I reached the mezzanine level, where the luxury boxes opened out into the concourse. It was a slaughterhouse. The thousands of people who had been trying to escape the stadium earlier hadn't made it out. They had been caught in the crush when the turn happened. Now, they were standing still, perfectly still, facing the field. Thousands of them, packed shoulder to shoulder in the wide concourses. They were all connected by those gray strands, a web of biological wiring that ran from the floor, through their feet, and into their necks. I had to get through them to reach the north gate. I moved along the wall, my shield held tight. I tried to be silent, but the gear rattled with every step. I was halfway across the mezzanine when the thrumming stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. It was a vacuum. Every single head in the concourse snapped around to face me. 1,000 pairs of eyes, clouded over with a milky gray film, locked onto my position. They didn't scream. They just moved. It was like a dam breaking. A wall of meat and jersey fabric surged toward me. I backed into a concession stand, the smell of stale popcorn and copper filling my nose. I jammed my back against the stainless steel counters. I had 6 rounds in the mag and 2 spare magazines. My baton was heavy in my hand. The first one hit the shield so hard I felt my shoulder blade pop. I shoved back, hearing the ribs crack on the other side of the plastic. I fired a shot into the eye socket of the next one, dropping it instantly. Another lunged over the counter to my left. I swung the baton, catching it in the throat, then used the butt of the stick to crush its windpipe. I was breathing purely on adrenaline now, my lungs screaming for oxygen that was being displaced by the heat of the crowd. I didn't realize I was hurt until the adrenaline started to ebb. I looked down. My left hand was missing 2 fingers, sheared off by a piece of the gate or the blast. I hadn't even felt it. My uniform was a tattered mess of black nylon and blood. My boots were soaked. I found a discarded SUV near the edge of the lot, the driver's door open and the engine still idling. I climbed in, the leather seat feeling like a cloud compared to the concrete I'd been living on. I looked in the rearview mirror. My face was a mask of soot, blood, and that gray slime. My eyes were bloodshot, the capillaries popped from the pressure of the stadium sound. I put the car in gear and drove. I didn't look back at the stadium. I didn't think about the 100,000 people inside or the man with the ring. I didn't think about the city or the fact that my radio was dead. The car hit a bump, and a fresh wave of pain from my hand made me gasp. I looked at the stump of my fingers. I took a roll of electrical tape from the glove box and wrapped it tight, biting my lip until it bled to keep from screaming. The pain was good. The pain meant I was still separate from the gray matter. I was still me. I drove until the gas light came on. I was 10 miles outside the city, on a back road lined with pine trees. I pulled over and killed the engine. The silence here was real. No thrumming. Just the wind in the needles. I got out of the car and leaned against the hood. My body was shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that started in my knees and worked its way up to my jaw. I reached into my pocket and found a crushed pack of cigarettes I'd taken off a looter 3 days ago. I lit one with trembling hands. The smoke tasted like heaven and ash. I looked at my hands. The blood was drying, turning into a dark, stiff crust. My shield was gone. My baton was gone. My badge was pinned to a vest that was mostly held together by duct tape and hope. I wasn't a hero. I hadn't saved anyone. I hadn't stopped the turn. I had just survived the night. In the distance, toward the city, a second violet light flared up. Then a third. They were synchronized, a network of stadiums and arenas all waking up at once, calling to each other across the dark. The thrumming started again, a low vibration in the ground that I could feel through the soles of my boots. I finished the cigarette and crushed it under my heel. My left arm was dead weight, my ribs were likely shattered, and I was bleeding through my bandages. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a destination. I reached into the back seat and grabbed a heavy tire iron. It wasn't a riot baton, but it had weight. It had reach. I gripped it with my good hand, feeling the cold steel against my palm. I started walking away from the lights. Every step was a battle against the gravity of my own exhaustion. My shins throbbed. My back felt like it was being scorched by a blowtorch. I didn't think about tomorrow. I didn't think about the end of the world.